Hello, my name is Lance Sullivan from Mindfulness Leicester, and I've put these few thoughts together for you in the context of the current situation, which I guess for all of us is somewhat unprecedented. And as you can imagine, over the past few weeks, we've been asked a lot of questions by a lot of people who are trying to make sense of this situation. So I thought for our purposes today, I'd put this together in a question and answer format. And my wife Claire will be asking the questions and I'll be answering them. Of course, at any time after you've listened to this, if you have any questions or queries, just contact HR and they have my details and I'll answer your questions straight away. So perhaps over to Claire for the first question.
So what is mindfulness then?
Yeah, I thought you might ask that. Mindfulness is about paying attention. It's about being aware of what we're doing whilst we're doing it. And in essence, there's a tuning in there. We tune into ourselves, other people and our environment in the present moment. And it was brought into the Western world by a man called John Kabat-Zinn, who was the Emeritus Professor of Medicine at the University of Boston in Massachusetts in the 1970s. And he said that mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And if we unpackage that, by on purpose, he means that we don't allow our attention to drift and then land where it wishes. We actively pay attention to all aspects of our experience, moment by moment by moment. So there's the on purpose bit. In the present moment is that we don't allow what's happening to be tinged by our difficulties or judgments of past experience, nor do we allow it to be influenced by notions of what might be in the future. We stay with what actually is happening moment by moment. And he also went on to say non-judgmentally, and that's where the challenge comes in, because we're very, very good at bringing expectations as to how things ought to be to our experience. And when we do that, we either like something or dislike something, and we hold on to those fixed expectations. So as far as possible, we tend to, or try to avoid that, but it is challenging. But the paying attention without expectation is probably the key aspect.
So if I'm working from home, how would it help me to deal with feelings of isolation, say, stress and anxiety?
It would help you by seeing that there's a purpose behind what you're doing and dropping the idea that things should be a certain way. It's understandable that you might feel that you've to a certain extent been abandoned and you're unsupported, but there will be structures in place for you to turn to, and it's a question of taking that moment by moment. When it comes to stress and anxiety, again, the key to those emotions comes from the thought processes that we bring to bear. And you could very easily say that stress comes about not from what happens, but from how we perceive and process it. And we, of course, are capable of seeing what thoughts we're bringing to bear and putting them to one side if they're not relevant. Anxiety, which of course is closely related to stress, also tends to involve feelings of fear of what might happen. So there's a little bit of projection into the future going on there. And anxiety, in many respects, is a gap between how things are and how we think they ought to be. And in that gap lies an opportunity for us, because if we drop the idea that things should be this way and deal with them as they actually are, then we're engaging with the reality of the situation. So the answer to the question comes from our perspective and processing of our thoughts. So you could in fact say that the difficulty comes not from the event, but from how we deal with it.
So, how does mindfulness help us or tell us about our difficult thoughts?
With mindfulness, we see our thoughts as mental events, and that's all they are. Just like waves appear on the surface of the ocean without necessarily having any special meaning, so our thoughts bubble up all the time. It's often referred to as a monkey mind, the mind swinging from branch to branch and going from tree to tree without necessarily any structure to it. And what we can tend to do is to latch onto a thought and to see that thought as reality, whereas we need to be a little more discriminatory in that respect and see the thought as a mental event and see whether it's actually relevant to our current priorities. Because if we are able to answer the question, what's the most important thing for me to be doing in this moment, and then go ahead and do that, we're being as effective as we possibly can be, and we're doing the best that we can. And when we're doing that, we have to accept that we're doing all that we can. So there's a gentleness there, and that gentleness extends not just to ourselves but to other people as well. Because we can have the idea, and it's pushed to us by people who usually want to sell us things, ideas or products, that we have a huge amount of influence and a huge amount of control over what happens to us. Actually, all that we can control are our thoughts and our actions, and everything else is outside of our control. Having said that, our thoughts and the actions associated with them are very, very powerful, because the actions become our behaviours and that becomes our reality.
So what's the best way to learn it?
The best way to learn it is to sit in what we call meditation. And that's a word that's tinged with all sorts of connotations again, because many, many people think that meditation is about spacing, getting spaced out, becoming calm, sitting still, switching off. Apart from sitting still, in its basic practice, it's none of those things. It isn't about regaining another state. It isn't about getting anywhere at all. In fact, it's probably the only systematic human activity that doesn't have a destination in mind. We're not trying to become more flexible, we're not going for the burn, we're not looking to discover something new. What we're trying to understand is precisely where we are in this present moment. And the way in which we do that, and it might be appropriate to try this now, is our sitting practice, where we just sit in a comfortable posture where we're physically relaxed and mentally alert. We notice our breathing and we notice our thoughts. But instead of engaging with the thoughts and wandering off and thinking, well, that's a nice thing to think about while I'm sitting still, we notice the thought arise and we let it go. And we do that time after time after time. And what we're doing there is learning metacognitive skills. We're noticing when our mind isn't where we want it to be. We're moving our attention from where we don't want it to be back to where we do want it to be. And we're learning how to keep it there. And in essence, what we're doing is learning to gain control of our deliberate thinking. And when we do that, we're able to bring the rational mind to bear on every aspect of our experience, and that way we can secure the best possible outcomes for us. So that might be an appropriate moment to give that a try. So if we get ourselves into a comfortable posture with the back straight but not tense, so that we're physically relaxed and mentally alert, and it's perfectly okay to have the eyes closed, but as soon as possible in our meditation practice we want to have the eyes open, because that's how we engage with the world. The hands can be placed comfortably in the lap, feet flat on the floor, and the back reasonably straight, so we're not slumping back in the chair. we're paying attention, and we're sitting with dignity. That would be a good way to put it. And all that we do is sit, breathe and notice. Now I've got something down here called a singing bowl, which you're probably all aware. I'll strike that 3 times to start the meditation and twice to finish it. And I suggest that we just sit perhaps for about 5 minutes as I guide us through the process. So let's give it a try. So we sit in a relaxed posture with the back straight but not tense, allowing us to be physically relaxed but mentally alert. We notice the contact that we have with the chair, that our feet have flat on the floor, and that the hands have placed comfortably in the lap. We breathe in and out through the nose, just letting the breath be as it comes, no technique to apply. And we notice the breath wherever we feel it most strongly, perhaps the tip of the nose, the chest or the abdomen. And as the breath flows in and out through the nose, we follow it all the way in to the turnaround point and all the way out again. We sense into the shape of the body and the space surrounding it. We bring our awareness to the weight of the body, allowing ourselves to settle. If we notice sounds, we don't respond or react to them, we just let them be, without seeking to disturb them. Just sitting, just breathing. And as we do that, we have no agenda to follow. There's nothing to analyse or resolve, and there's no place to get to. Fully aware of every aspect of our experience. And when thoughts come along, which they will, we just see them as mental events and let them go. Rather like watching a cloud move across the clear blue sky. So we neither think, nor do we try not to think. We just allow the thoughts to arise and to move on. notice the quality of the breath, whether it's long and deep or short and shallow. And again, we just make that observation without desiring one state of being above another. We just notice what's happening. And as we sit, we're not trying to become calm or reach any particular state. All that we're doing, moment by moment, is noticing what's happening without sticking labels on the experience and judging it as either good or bad. So if we find ourselves wondering whether we're doing this right, the fact is there's no doing it wrong. All we're doing is sitting, breathing and being, staying present with our moment by moment experience. So Claire, any more questions?
Oh, I had lots of thoughts in that meditation. Is that normal?
Yes, that's perfectly normal. It's the nature of the mind to produce thoughts, just as it's the nature of the ocean to produce waves. And it's important that we see those thoughts not as definitive statements of reality, but as mental events. And then, at the appropriate time, we can decide how we evaluate them as to whether they actually represent reality or whether they're just something thrown up by the mind.
Okay. So, if I'm more mindful, does that help me to cultivate kindness? Is there a philosophy behind it?
Yes, it would help you to cultivate kindness, because you would be dropping the ought, the idea that things ought to be a certain way. And the most important relationship that you can address kindness to is the relationship that you have with yourself, because that's the underpinning of all others. You have to accept yourself as you are and be gentle with yourself and realise your limitations. And if moment by moment you do the best that you can, keeping in mind the question, what's the most important thing for me to be doing in this moment? If you address that honestly and to the best of your endeavour, realising that we all have our limitations, there's not much more that you can do. And yes, there is a philosophy behind it, and it's the philosophy of Buddhism. Mindfulness is very often taught and practiced in a completely secular way, and that's absolutely fine. But it does have that depth of philosophy that goes back over 2,500 years to the time of the Buddha. And that's based upon notions that in life there is suffering, and we have to contend with that. That everything is impermanent. Things arise, are here for a while, and we don't know how long, and then pass and move on. That applies to the seasons, that applies to our physical health, it applies to everything. So in the context of that impermanence and change, we have to find our best path through that. And that involves choices at many junctures during the day. And if we ask ourselves when we come to those choices, what's the good thing to do? And do the good thing, we're doing the best that we can.
So how does this mindfulness work, and how long does it take?
There's ample evidence, because mindfulness has been studied by physiologists and scientists, that the practice of mindful meditation, as we've just done, will produce physical changes in the structure of the brain. Because if we are finding that our life is stressful or that we're visited by anxiety, it's reckoned that the processing of our experiences is taking place in a part of the brain called the amygdala. That's a very ancient part of the brain, and one that we share with other animals, that deals with very strong responses. It deals with fight, flight, or freeze. Absolutely excellent when we've been pursued by a saber-toothed tiger. We sprint away, or we fight our way out of a situation, or we freeze, hoping that we won't be noticed, and we live to survive another day. But if our triggers are an email, an awkward remark, the weather, the car breaking down, somebody cutting us up in traffic, and we're functioning from the amygdala, our responses will be way over the top and way out of proportion in terms of what's needed. Over a period of time, and it's reckoned to be between 6 and 8 weeks, that place of functioning in the brain changes from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, which deals with rational thought and choices, and in effect we find a space between the stimulus and our response. The French, bless them, have their word for responsible, which is responsable, and they spell the ending of the word, the last four letters, as A-B-L-E, as opposed to R-I-B-L-E, and I find that quite salutary, because it reminds me that we are able to choose our response, provided that we have the space to do so. And that's what mindful practice on a regular basis brings about. And all you need to do is do what we've just done, regularly, without expectation, and the change will come.
A friend of mine says that she's quite angry about this situation that we've got right now. So what could she do about that?
It's most unlikely, I don't know who your friend is, but it's most unlikely that your friend is in a situation where she can actually change what's happening. What she can change is how she perceives it and processes it. And with coronavirus, of which personally I'd never heard until a couple of months ago, at the beginning of the year we were all talking Brexit. That was the subject of the moment. I don't think I've heard the word uttered in the past month or so, but we're hearing coronavirus, we're hearing social distancing, all the words that are associated with that. And it is quite disturbing, and anger comes about because of frustrated expectation. So your friend will have expectations that things ought to be a certain way, and that bubbles over when those expectations are not met. What we're able to do with practice is to drop the expectation, and instead of expecting things to be a certain way, we deal with them as they are, and the fuel for the anger disappears. Because quite understandably, we like patterns. We don't like to be reinventing the world time and time and time again. We like stimulation, we like something new, but we like to feel as though we're under control. But as I said earlier, all that we actually have under our direct control are our thoughts and our actions. Everything else is things that we have to bend ourselves towards. And if we seek certainty in that which is uncertain, we're bound to suffer, because we're looking for something that isn't there. There are too many things in the mix for certainty to be around. And the more we hold on to expectations that things are going to be a certain way, or ought to be a certain way, the more disappointments we're going to have. So the answer to the difficult situation is in our grasp. Drop the expectation and deal with what is, and we're fine. And so often our emotions go onto autopilot, and that can be a big problem. Autopilot is great. It's what we do when we drive a car. When we're learning to drive, we have to push the pedal down, push the clutch pedal down, push the gear lever forward, indicate, check the mirror, turn the wheel, push the right foot down, etc., etc. While we're trying to learn all of those individual things, it's a hugely challenging task. Once we've learned how to drive, we can then start to enjoy the journey. When we walk, we don't have to think about how we place our feet, etc., etc. We know how to do that. So those functions can happily go into autopilot. But the mind, in its helpful way, seeks to automate other things as well. So once our emotions get onto autopilot, then we find ourselves drawn to a reaction as opposed to a response. And that can sometimes put us into big trouble, because the world is most unlikely all of the time to conform to our expectations. Drop the expectation and the problem doesn't arise.
So how can I be kinder to myself?
Notice when you're not. Notice what thought stories you bring to bear. Because what we do with that when things happen is look for a story. And we start to write a narrative, of how things are, of how things ought to be, and we tend to parcel things up. We're looking for neat little parcels of predictability, and we like to feel that we're in control. But with mindfulness, we have a deftness of approach to life. It's not a technique, it's a way of being. And the Dalai Lama said that we should be very, very grateful for people who challenge our patience, because that gives us the opportunity to see how patient we really are. And there was a very well-known American Buddhist teacher, Charlotte Joko Beck, who came up with a lovely expression which I think sums this up quite nicely. She said, "Life always gives us exactly the teacher we need at every moment. This includes every mosquito, every misfortune, every red light, every traffic jam, every obnoxious supervisor or employee, every illness, every loss, every moment of joy or depression, every addiction, every piece of garbage, every breath. Every moment is the guru." And my interpretation of that is what she's saying is that with all these interactions that take place during the day, we have a choice as to how we process them, and we learn from the choices that we make because we reap the consequences. And when we're making the best choices that we can, particularly as we learn from our practice, there's a good possibility that we will make the best choices. And that probably is the key to happiness.